models are not there to tell people what to do. You don't say, oh, this model says you should, or, I'm basing my coaching on that model. Models are about understanding things. And if that helps you to understand what coaching is about, then my suggestion would be that this then influences coach education and development. So it's coach education and development that should be looking at the models and saying, if we want to prepare people to be coaches, and we've got some idea of what coaching's about because we've got some frameworks that help us to understand it, then this is what coach education and development should look like.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. Today I had the absolute privilege of being joined by Professor John Lyle of Leeds Beckett University. John, for anyone who's maybe from a non-academic sphere and listening in, John was the very first person actually to establish a postgraduate programme in sports coaching in the UK. He has had a career in academia for 40 plus years, and he has been an absolute pioneer in establishing coaching as a science. Like, I generally would say that I don't think there's anyone I admire more and who I think has been in this game for as long as John. His knowledge is just incredible, and we kind of reflect back on John's career, and because in reflecting on John's career, in some sense you reflect on coaching science and its evolution, and we get at where we've arrived in understanding coaching as a science, and we discuss some of the sort of core tenets of that conversation, at least insofar as what we could fit into the conversation. It could have went on forever, but around, what the role of the coach is, what coaching means, the idea of domains within coaching, the idea of how we may or may not model the coaching process. Should we continue to? Why model the coaching process? What are some of the universal elements of the coaching process? Do they exist? Is that a problematic question to ask? And we consider as well about who owns coaching. Is it the academic enterprise? Is it the professional coach? Is there a misalignment of power sharing in that conversation? We eventually go on to touch on the different ologies that exist within the coaching science sphere as well as part of that. And we consider, where do we go next? What do we need to discover more about? Who is going to give the answers to the problems that we ask? And this is very much a conversation for coach researchers to consider and reflect on. It really made me reflect, and I was able to ask John some questions as well, where I think that feeling is mutual. And only because I think I come from a place of a bit of, not disillusionment, but a real cynicism to a point around where I feel there is disconnect insofar as what we should do as academics versus what we do, and I'm complicit in that as well. But we need to keep ourselves self-aware. So academics within coaching really should listen to this conversation. People who aren't academics in coaching, you deserve to understand more about the evidence that at times tells you what to do. So you need to actually also learn about coaching in this side of coaching research. And you'll have your own thoughts on it, and importantly, it's your thoughts that are going to drive the science further, because that's where it needs to go. I think it needs to go back into the hands of coaches, the people that coaching science should ultimately serve, and the athletes who are under our care. So honestly, it was such a fantastic conversation. I loved every minute of it. I hope you enjoy it too. While I've got you as well, just please consider subscribing to the show, following the show. You've heard it from me before. Also, I just want to put a wee call to action insofar as how you might be able to support the show in different ways as well. Above and beyond subscription and those sorts of things, I want to increase the production of the show. There is a monetary element to that. You can support the show and offer a financial donation using the support links. You can do it on a monthly basis and a recurring thing, or it might even be a one-off basis. We have different means in which you can reach out to me, and again, please visit my website, and maybe you'll be able to discover more about how we might be able to work together. But all those things will feed into the ambitions that I have for not just this podcast, but the mission that this podcast is trying to serve. The podcast sits within the Labour of Sports Coaching mission, is between the podcast and the newsletter, which again is continuing. It's a new thing, the self-determined coach. Go and check that out, and you can discover more about that, looking at motivational psychology, and it is a more niche conversation. But, they all sit within this objective of trying to bring you guys, and I'm part of that equation, more insights, more information, more disruption, more clarity as well. It can't constantly be about fragmentation. And I want to help to that, and you can help me in that. So please consider those links. And yeah, enjoy the show. Let's get into it. It's a fantastic conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it. So let's go. So, John, it's great to have you. How are you?
I'm in good fettle, thank you.
Yeah.
Despite my advancing years, I'm still managing to get about. I'm still active, and I'm still writing. Probably more so in the last few years than I have for a long time. So yeah, it's good to still be engaged in the business.
Yeah, and that to me is just a testament of just how unbelievably fantastic you've been in your career as a real trendsetter in coaching, and certainly you established coaching science as its own sort of thing. We were even just talking there off air, John, around some different experiences that we've had, and when you mentioned around the last time we actually met, it was at Crick in Worcester, and I don't know if you'll remember this, but I think this was just a testament to how much you had people in the kind of palm of your hand. You made a joke. You essentially described a scientific phenomenon, but it was a made up term that you done, and me being like I was just a master's student at the time, and I was so eager to learn, and I never scribbling this word down, and then you revealed that it was a laugh. It was a kid, and I was so embarrassed at the time, but it was just because people were so hooked, and the reason for that is, John, and again for anyone that isn't familiar with you, maybe from outside of academia, you were like the first person to establish a postgraduate program in sports coaching in the UK way back in the 80s. Would this have been, John? Round about then, and ever since then your career has been about establishing coaching science, its own thing. So I want to kind of reflect on that with you, and we'll kind of move through the years and maybe understand how you're currently thinking, where you've maybe seen improvements, and maybe where you've seen stagnation even, I don't know. But let's think about point zero with that. When coaching was at a time where there just wasn't a science, it just wasn't a thing, why did you set about trying to change that? What was the real crux of your ambition across the last 30 years in this space?
Well, it's kind of you to say 30.
Upwards.
rather than what it actually is. But I was a PE teacher for admittedly a very short period of time, as my wife keeps reminding me. Not really a teacher. I was only teaching for about 3 years. But then I started working in PE college and training PE teachers. And we kind of had I wouldn't say there was no antagonism, but there were certainly one or two people who were involved in PE at that time who kind of looked on PE and sport as two different things, as if sport was all bad because its values were wrong and it was too competitive, and it was the values, the ethics involved in it were not as they should be compared to education and where they felt the values are better. And I was kind of caught in the middle as a performer in high performance sport in some ways, and also having just begun to become a coach. I'd always done some coaching, and as a PE teacher, you're in sports leadership situations all the time. But it gradually coalesced around this notion that there's something different about coaching than there is teaching. Mm. To begin with, and I wasn't there, I have hasten to say, but in the 50s, even the late 40s and the 50s, and then into the 60s, I don't know that it was seen as much of a difference between teaching and coaching. Lots and lots of coaches were actually PE teachers who were working after school and then also worked in clubs, and it was seen as the way in. And I was left with this notion that maybe there's more of a difference between the two. And we gradually came to the view that maybe we need to educate people, not as coming from, say, teaching with then a governing body, first or second level award, but maybe there's more to it. maybe we need to educate people in a different way. So we started with a diploma course at Dunfermline College, as it was at the time. And we started with, I think, 6 or 8 national coaches and put them through a kind of preliminary version of the diploma. That was in the last years of 79 into 81, something like that. And then gradually we started recruiting people to the diploma. The diploma became a diploma in professional studies, so it was acknowledged as a, if you like, PUCA diploma. And then it gradually morphed into a postgraduate degree, and was still going when I left there in the mid-90s to go south to work somewhere else. And over that period of time, I felt we were successful in separating coaching from other areas like teaching or instructing or fitness or other areas like that, and gradually finding its own feet, if you like, as something worthy of studying. And at that the problem at the time was that there wasn't a great deal of academic material on which to base this. And we were actually sometimes still borrowing from teaching, if you like. But then we could gradually move into some of the Eastern European training theory stuff. And America had been looking at coach education for a bit longer, but was very high school collegiate based, in which case these were really teachers and coaches at the same time. So they still weren't separating them as well as we wanted. But so we had to start doing our own resources as well. We had to start publishing. We had to start doing. There were no PhD students around. And for a while there weren't any even master's students around. So all of that kind of had to be created. And then, I mean, I don't know when the date was, but probably from the late 90s onwards and into the noughties, as they're called, we had an explosion of academic work. We had an explosion of undergraduate degrees and postgraduate degrees, and I think it's kept exploding.
And did that kind of align with to the first edition of when you published Sports Coaching Concepts, a framework of coaching practice? And I don't think there's a coaching researcher, a student today who hasn't read that textbook at some time or another. Was that not around about that time?
That was
first edition.
It was 2002 that it was actually published, but it was probably based on a whole load of work from the 90s forward. And it was a way of just saying we need to bring this together into some kind of textbook, I suppose, simply because none existed. There were some of the training theory books, Frank Dick's book and Bompa, the training theory type planning things. And there were some American texts which were a wee bit like how to coach in a high school environment. So, and then this is beginning to sound like a bit of a history lesson, but in the late 70s and into the 80s, Canada and Australia both had the kind of epiphany that we had later on when we didn't win any medals in several Olympics. But they didn't do particularly well in like 76 onwards. And so they decided they needed better coach education. And it was they who started producing some of what we would call general theory about coaching. And it was on the back of that we started to move into recognizing that maybe there was something about coaching itself that we could talk about, instead of talking about it as teaching or psychology or philosophy or more likely physiology.
And is that where we perhaps arrive at some of the sort of, when I look back at your work, John, and the work that you continue to publish, there was always the central sort of themes around the core questions of what a coach is, like the role of coach, even the definition of coaching, to then thinking about domains and does that play a role in it, and then we got into all the sort of stuff around modelling. So I wonder if we might work around some of those different elements, like, what coaching is, because I know I want to explore what's your definition of coaching. And I know that sounds like it's a very difficult question, or it seems like a difficult question to answer, because nowadays it's like very domain specific, or is it? Or I want to kind of tie into there, because I know sometimes you come from quite a performance focused background, and that's played a role often in how you've maybe conceptualized coaching, if I'm correct. But there's a lot of nuance within that. So yeah, just start that off for us. How would you conceive of coaching, and how's that fitted in perhaps into this ongoing academic enterprise, if you will?
It's probably easier to talk about how I would conceive of it than how I would define it.
Okay.
If I'd known I was being asked the question directly, I would have looked at my latest writing and tried to find out what I'd actually said. The first few publications that I started on, and even through into the 2002 book, if you like, a lot of that was based around the notion that I think we were making assumptions about coaching rather than actually getting down to saying, well, coaching is actually about this. This is what coaching is. So the question I was always asking myself was, what makes it different from other things?
Mm-hmm.
So if coaching is about leading and teaching people sport and whatever, and treating people properly and developing them, and also, well, other people do things like that too. So what makes us different was always the question that was underlying where I was going with this. And it's taken me an awful long time to try to come to an answer. And I'm not sure whether I'm at that answer yet. So it's getting a bit late to come up with it. But it's easier to start from the end. I've come to the conclusion now that it's not a terribly helpful term. So that if I said to you, if you asked me what I did for a living and I said I'm an engineer, you'd kind of go, yeah, well, tell me more. Or if I said I was an administrator, I'm a technician. Even if I said I'm a teacher, you'd kind of go, well, I'm not actually sure what you mean. Tell me a bit more about what you mean. And I now feel that that's the same. If you say, well, I'm a sports coach. Well, actually, I don't like the term sports coach. I'm a sport coach. I coach sport, not sports.
Why do you make that the distinction?
Because I think a long time ago, we just thought that somebody who was coached gymnastics or coached any other sport that you can name, and we just lazily used the term a sports coach because we thought that was a person who worked in all sorts of different sports. And it seems to me that there are many kinds of coach. You could be a vocal coach, you can be a theatrical coach, you can be a business coach, you can be all sorts of coaches. And in which case, the ones we're talking about work in sport. They are sport coaches.
It definitely stuck with me, that I actually deliberately, when I had like even the cover art for this podcast, I had to make sure I sent it back when I initially said sports on it, because it was a lesson that stuck with me way back when. And it was passed on to me from other people as well, John. I completely agree.
So I'm now got to that point where what I'm saying is it's not terribly helpful to say that you're a sport coach. And I don't jump up and down anymore. If somebody says they're a sports coach, fine. But because it's not enough to say that, then you do have to ask yourself, yes, which I think you hinted at before, is there a kernel of something that runs through everybody who calls themselves a sport coach? And is it enough to define yourself that way? And you could bring it down to the very, very basics, which is that you prepare people for improved sports performance. I mean, I'm not deliberately picking those words, but it's something like that.
Yeah, you hear words like goal-directed. It becomes very fluffy, doesn't it? Because you're trying to capture
you then
everything.
Say, well, okay,
like, what's the point?
A bit like Julian North's work. You could pick half a dozen things and say it's instrumental, it's goal-orientated, it's relational, it's social. Yes, but so are many other things as well, incidentally. So you can't just say it's goal-orientated. You have to then say, well, what kind of goals do we work towards? It's instrumental, certainly, but so should all occupations be. It's relational, yes. We deal with people. It's almost all interactional. You kind of have some coaching done over the telephone. The kind of giving people who are triathletes or long distance runners or something.
Yeah,
you can,
remote coaching.
Yeah, sometimes you can give them schedules over the phone or something, but even that's interactional. So you can spend some useful time deciding on what the essential elements are of coaching. But the point I'm trying to very badly get to is that until we start talking about domains or categories or just social context, then we don't truly begin to describe what we mean by a coach. So for me, a high-performance sport coach is light years away from somebody who is teaching 10-year-olds in a primary school after-school club the rudiments of, doesn't matter what it is, hockey or football or rugby or tennis or something. The two things are as far apart as being a telephone engineer and a nuclear scientist. I'm not sure if those are well chosen, but so for me, it's taken an awful long time to come to the view that sport coaching is an umbrella term that should only be seen as an umbrella term that coalesces a whole number of social occupations. And I don't mind if Sport England want to say that everybody who is leading in a sport context is a coach. I don't think that's helpful. In fact, it's a political thing, because then you can count, there's far more coaches around if you count everybody. And yes, we do need people to be less obese, more active, keep away some of the health deficits that are around.
Didn't you start, because you brought in with sort of some of the terminology around participation coaching, high performance, and then you had even sort of bridging the gap there of like developmental coaching, where it's like, still it's not about results, but we're coaching people towards, being in a results-based environment. So there was a wee bit of a help, I suppose, around trying to get into the particulars of coaching and maybe the context-bounded elements to it. I wanted to ask you, John, do we do a terribly good job at still recognising there are shared properties of coaching? Because I do wonder when sometimes there's rebound effects to this, just people have in the last 20, 30 years now, we became very into the idea of coaching being contextualised, and rightly so. But does it lead itself, in your view, or just I'm interested in your opinion on this when I say it, does it lead it? Sometimes we're in a space where people, I think, can't appreciate that participation-based sport can be competitive, vice versa. We sometimes want to box our thoughts into a particular thing, and then it over brackets it, where I wonder where there could be space to get back to the fundamental components that maybe are universal in coaching. I know some people say that doesn't exist, and without getting into the fluff of saying goal-orientated practice, this and that, but I always think about, if I was to be contentious here and say, coaching's about getting better at a sport, like there's a skill-based element of the sport that I think permeates the main specific orientations of that role. I don't know, but I just want to know your thoughts around domains have been a good thing. Do we sometimes go too into that, or what's your feelings on it if you disagree as such? I'm just curious just to get your ideas on some of that.
I don't think we can dismiss the domains, because if you then look at some reasonable criteria that would define what domains would be defined as, or what would be used to define domains, it becomes pretty obvious that there are distinct differences between them. So I don't think we can dismiss them. On the other hand, are there some commonalities across the domains that might help us in coach education, for example, so that it may be that in high performance coaching there are particular skills and functions that are very particular to that domain. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be preparing coaches for work in that area through coach education that's in the developmental domain, or even starting further back, if you like. So are there commonalities in, I mean, I would be contentious as well and say, I think there are commonalities, but if you reduce the commonalities too much, it becomes meaningless. So if you only say that coaching is about making people better at sport, it's probably not wrong. In fact, I don't think it is wrong, but it's not all that helpful. It's not really. It's not telling you very much to say that it's about. I mean, an engineer's about fixing things.
Equally, if you do that too much the other way, and this is kind of the idea, does it actually help us as a science develop a core basis, a way of moving forward? I wonder if there's so much fragmentation that can occur through domain-orientated thought that we never... This maybe is a bit of a segue onto, I know you've had attempts at modelling the coaching process for coaching. I wonder if this is maybe a good time to get into the rationale for why you've done that. I'd be really interested to explore that, because that felt, whenever I read that work, some of your work, John, I used to always feel like I really understood this was a means of pushing our practice forward through at least mapping out some degree of universality, or at least, I don't know if maybe it's misunderstanding as such, but I wonder if we could chat around that to understand your work further.
I probably going to argue against myself. And say that the reason for starting down the, call it the model road, was that I was searching for something that was universal to all coaching. And was it possible to find something that, that defined all coaches? And I don't mean defined as in a definition, but the process that they were engaged in could be recognised in a model. And that model has been the one that I did way back in the 2002. I think it was probably in the book before that, was criticised a lot, still is, for being too linear, too system kind of based. But actually, if you read what I actually said was, this is a model for coaching. But what we now need to do is we need to go and look at coaching itself and apply this to the coaching context and come up with new models that actually reflect what coaches do. So we need models of coaching rather than for coaching. But it might be helpful to start with one that gives you a framework that you can apply. And then you can go and look at the coaches and come back and say, well, it's not like that at all. It's like this. And I'd go, great, because that's what we wanted all the time. We wanted to know what it was actually like.
See, the irony, John, as well, is that as much as that was criticised, and it served its purpose as an experiment, a thought process, an experiment, it's kind of ironic in the sense that we now move to a space, I feel, where we're trying to develop models of coaching, but most of academia, I think, in the coaching space is still important frameworks into coaching and telling coaches how to act in such a way that that's not necessarily built out of the practice. Because the reason why, when you mentioned around, like, you know, the progress we've made so far as a coaching science, I often wonder why, for example, we still look at your model and other coaching process models out there. I see them as they're like exhibits in the sense that we revisit them as academics, but I don't see models, coaching frameworks, building research. I still see coaching frameworks as being something we revisit every now and again, and most of the papers are still frameworks from outside of coaching, or coaching trying to align with outside of coaching frame. I don't know. I wonder if there's an irony there.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Mark. I'm not sure I agree that there are none. I think we've moved on from where I was, and colleagues that I work with, particularly in Leeds, Julian North and Bob Muir. That
orchestration and stuff,
I think, have moved into different models, and that Bob and I just brought out a new book on coach development, and there are more models, if you like, in there. But Julian has what he calls the ERE model. And if I make a general point about models, models are not there to tell people what to do. You don't say, "Oh, this model says you should," or I'm basing my coaching on that model. That's not. Models are about understanding things, and if that helps you to understand what coaching is about, then my suggestion would be that this then influences coach education and development. So it's coach education and development that should be looking at the models and saying, if we want to prepare people to be coaches, and we've got some idea of what coaching's about because we've got some frameworks that help us to understand it, then this is what coach education and development should look like. But we don't go direct. I mean, I can remember a phrase that was used in some writing somewhere, not by me, that the criticism was that coaches weren't using my model. And I mean, I kind of was laughing at the time when it was said. And I think, well, no, I didn't write it for the coaches. The coaches weren't supposed to be using it. It's not for them. It's meant to influence thinking. And I think the thinking influences coach education and development, and then it influences the coaches.
And I think that's probably more the point of making it. There's a repurposing that has to be had, isn't there? I think that's the idea, isn't it? It's like there's frameworks that exist now, and they tell coaches that they should do this, but the framework wasn't built out of coaching, or if it has been, it's again maybe not built out of the domain of coaching that we've referred back to earlier on, that we know is essential in understanding the particulars of coaching and what it requires and stuff like that. That we need to pay attention to that coaches should be able to see, here's a model, it helps us understand this aspect of it, because coaches need to put on different hats at different times. But then coaching as its own process deserves to have its own leverage of how they use a module, when they use it, if they use it.
I kind of hear where you're going with this, Mark, and I find it interesting, because I'm almost at the point now of saying I don't think it's possible to model the coaching process. We can provide lots of models for coaching, some of which might be like some I've done, where it's derived in a sense from experience and from the academic world, and some that, for example, Bob and Julian, my colleagues, are doing now. But these are only still helping us to have some insight into what coaching's about. They are still not directing the way we behave, because largely they are schematics. They kind of tell you what all the important bits are, but they don't actually tell you how to put it together. They don't say, this is how you operationalize this model. That's what coach education development's for, and experience and trial and error and all those other things that coaches do. So is it possible to have a model of coaching?
Chris Christian spoke about that, didn't he? Even the two-dimensional element, it's on paper, you can't even see it, it's not understandable in that context.
I don't think we can embrace usefully everything from, just use a very simple term, participation development through to performance. But if we call it high performance elite, and we've got other domains, and if we were to take the UK sports, well, not UK sports, they have a different view, but Sport England and UK coaching type view, that everything that walks is a coach, then that makes it so doubly difficult to have a model of coaching, because they actually said, if you go down to the park with your kids and kick a ball around, you're a coach. And that kind of opening the scope of coaching is a political thing, and it may have some advantages, but it makes it awful hard to, in conceptual terms, to pull it together. It doesn't. In fact, it doesn't hang together in conceptual terms. It's there for political reasons, resource and political reasons. So where do I go with models? I'm kind of at the point where I'm not going to try, because I don't think we can. we can come up with useful frameworks.
Well, let's talk about that then, John. So, see, useful frameworks. So, there's obviously, this was something else I was quite curious to ask you about. There's now there's different modes of thinking around coaching. Is coaching a cognitive process? Is coaching, relational? Is it sociological? Is it? And I know it is all these things, but I would be curious to know, or is coaching constructive and this, in different views of learning theories? That's me stealing some of the stuff that I tried to learn from you when you were my teacher way back when. But what has been your observation of what sort of way of thinking, and I forgot the psychology element of behaviourists, that sort of element, what's dominating the perspective space? And or does it even need to be a question of that? But I just wonder, have you observed, is there parity of thought, or do you see a dominant thought or a dominant mode of thinking to solve coaching related issues? Is there pros and cons to that? I just am quite curious to know, because just if we can maybe explore that to start. Because I see a lot of psychology. I see a lot of the decision making elements as well, like Abraham stuff, like professional decision making, do that round and round. And I wonder, is that okay? Just again, we're talking about building coaching as its own science. Can coaching own anything if it's always seen as a byproduct of a mode of thinking that's owned in different disciplines and those sorts of things? We wouldn't tell a psychologist to think unlike a psychologist, or we wouldn't tell.
Yeah.
Yet coaching has to, because it's a multidisciplinary act. It feels like we have to constantly learn from different disciplines and modes of thinking. But I wonder, does that inhibit our development as a science, or is that just the nature of coaching, that we must move with different modes of thought? I want to kind of get into that a little bit. I know it's a hard question to ask. It's a wee bit of a strange one.
You're making me think about this. One part of the answer, I'll come back in a second to what's dominant. But one part of the answer would be that if we take sport coaching, does it have a social, psychological, philosophical, physical dimension? And within each of those dimensions, we're almost talking about disciplines, academic disciplines there. Do they have their predominant ontologies and epistemologies, i.e. what they think is important about the way the world works and how best to access that knowledge? Then yes, they do. But so does everything else. So does teaching. So does nursing. So does particularly anything else, medicine, counselling, anything that involves people, anything which I would call treatment occupations. Now, I think I would happily classify coaching as a treatment occupation. We provide prescriptions to athletes, and social human athletes, and therefore it is social, it is relational, because it's physical performance for the most part. We can debate snooker and darts and things like that, but for the most part, and whether horses and motor cars count as, that kind of thing. But for the most part, it's about humans and it's about physical performance. And because it's about humans and what they've got inside here, then it's about emotions and it's about psychology and all sorts of other things as well. And it's about the technology of the sport. Whether that's about how to kick a ball or how to grease skis or how to set sails, there's a technology involved. So it's not surprising that there are all of these different perspectives on this particular treatment occupation, as there are for all other treatment occupations, like medicine and nursing and psychiatry and teaching, school teaching, and there'll be lots more that have social work and all sorts. So should there be people who specialise in telling us about the cognitive aspects of coaching? Well, yes. And should there be some who want to talk about the philosophical underpinnings of the way that we approach what we call sport coaching. Yeah, we will have more insight if we have all of those perspectives and disciplines. But
does it leave something for? Yeah, no, sorry, I don't want to interrupt your flow there, John.
Let me finish that bit.
Yeah, 100%.
Because what I'm going on to say is, I would wish that each of those perspectives brings us back to a better picture of what coaches do and what they ought to do. Now, when we say ought, we're in the realms of saying, well, it should be like this or it should be like that. So let's say what the ought options might be. Not that one is necessarily completely better than all the others, but at least what we're doing is saying, I think it should be like this, but I'm open to other people saying it should be like something else.
Well, is that not where we have this clashing between, I think, professional knowledge and the academic enterprise in a sense? Because, like what you've just alluded to there, if I've caught you that correct, that's higher order thinking, isn't it? It's like there's more than one solution to a problem. However, I sometimes feel like the commentary, and I know this is something, look, I'm guilty of this as well. I come from a motivational psychology lens of things, so I see things. But we all believe as academics that our way of seeing the world is the correct way. And the way in our writing is salesmanship. We write in such a way that suggests coaches need to do this. And sometimes I wonder if we need to temper the language a little bit, because unless we're able, and this is partly my reason for asking that question in itself, is I wonder where, in embracing all the different modes of thinking and understanding the relationship to what coaches do, sometimes I feel the tacit element of coaching and the instinctive elements that come from professional experiential knowledge, I feel like it's turned down slightly, or at the very least it's not understood as being a legitimate instinct that coaches can have for how they manage situations. That obviously we would come full circle that the evolution of coaching should be such that all these different modes of thinking create a base level of thought of coaches that in turn is fed into the instinctive stuff. But that's where I wonder about where we blur the lines between coaching research in a way as a way of understanding coaching for coaches to use as they need to, and coaching research is being equivalent to coaching, where I think there's a disconnect between practitioner and academic in some ways. And I don't think it's necessarily a conundrum that can be solved. Maybe it doesn't need to be solved. Maybe that's me being too cynical. But I do wonder if there's still scope for us, and it kind of leads us on to the other question I had for you, John, about where we need to go next. Because as both a science and maybe as a practice in coaching, recognising that we are always going to wed these things. Is it not been said for years and years? There's a gap between science and practice. Like, people have told me that have been here for much longer than me that they've been saying that for 40 years. And I keep wondering, are we getting better? Is the gap narrowing? Have you observed a narrowing? Or what's your thoughts on that? If anything I'm saying
let
makes any sense.
Let me try to come to that in a sense by finishing what I was going to say before.
Oh, sorry, apologies, John.
No.
Too excited to talk to you.
Because what I gave you was that notion of, to start with, of saying there are lots of different perspectives. And the view I would take is that none are more important than others. Some may give, what they give us are different answers to what coaches are doing. In other words, we understand more, we have more insights into coaching and coaching practice by taking a philosophical, psychological, sociological, etc. perspective. But they're just different perspectives because they ask different questions, so they come up with different answers. And that's an important little statement there, that because those disciplines have favoured ways of doing things and ask different questions, of course they come up with different answers. The important thing to appreciate is that that's not the whole answer. And back to something that you alluded to, I feel bursting into lecture mode, that yes, most academics could do with a little more humility, recognizing that they provide a little bit of an answer to something, but theirs is not the only answer. And that there are some academic writings, and there are some academics who in general start their papers by telling you how bad everybody else is and why the way they're going to approach it is so much better. And really, I'm not sure that's the best approach. They should just tell us what they're doing is valuable. And then let us make that judgment as to whether how valuable that is in comparison to other things. They don't need to tell us that everybody else is doing it wrongly. So to even go further back to what I was trying to say ages ago, in the 60s into the 70s, probably, the behavioural approach was the one that predominated. But that was largely because this came from America, where the behavioural observation program started. And we adopted them and we've been using them ever since. And we've changed them and we've come up with our own. Where are we now? I would hazard a guess that in terms of publications, and you have to always, you don't have to, but you can think of publications and journals and things as political entities, and that knowledge is created partly through, in academic terms, through publications. So whatever direction the editors take makes a difference. So I would say that from the 2000s onwards, there's been a little bit of a battle between a cognitive approach to coaching and the social approach to coaching. Social and relational. Much more relational. We actually should be saying much more about the social context in which coaching, the systems, national approach. We should be doing a wee bit more than we're doing, but the social relational approach has predominated to some extent. I mean, that's Robin Jones. I mean, these are not criticism. Some of the work is very, very good. This is Robin and bits of Chris and Paul Potrak and Lee Nelson, Ryan Groom. You can throw the names up. And then, so their criticism sometimes is by saying those cognitive people keep telling us it's only about, the decisions that coaches make, and it's all, well, no, it's not all about that. But coaches do make decisions. They make decisions every minute of the day, but as does everybody else. So it's important to understand the cognitive dimension. But they operate...
When you say cognitive, John, then if you elaborate that, what do we mean by cognitive dimension for those that maybe aren't as familiar with that? Is it in the planning? Is it in...
No, the cognitive... Well, the easiest is to put it in the context of what does it mean in practice? What it means in practice is making decisions. That decisions come from in the way we internalize knowledge and the way we apply that knowledge to the decisions that we have to make on a day-to-day basis, some of which will be deliberative, as in planning. We can sit back and give ourselves a bit of time to think about what we're going to do as a plan for coaching or for improvement. And yet, in the middle of a game of volleyball or basketball or ice hockey or something where we've got to make an immediate decision about what to do, that's a bit less deliberative because we haven't got as much time and we don't have as much knowledge and it's in an emotional context and etc. So it's a different kind of decision making. So there's a different kind of cognitive organization going on. And that's back to the business of it looks a bit intuitive, but actually it's not. It's a learned process of making different kinds of decisions. Because we recognize the pattern, this is back to what they would call naturalistic decision making, that this is, we recognize the pattern we see in front of us, the solutions are already stored in the mind, and we can make an immediate match, nearly. And if the match doesn't quite work, we maybe need to think about it a wee bit more so it becomes a bit more deliberative. And that's all that the professional judgment decision making is really just juxtaposing the deliberative, taking your time, with the more seemingly intuitive, not having much time.
So is that a bit of a fallacy? Is intuition like maybe I need to correct myself then, and make me reflect on the idea of all instinctive stuff? Instinct's born out of repetition to a degree. It's probably born out of experience. So is it a bit of a false term, perhaps? In that sense?
I don't think it's instinctive. there's very little, I'm not a qualified psychologist either, but I wouldn't have said that much of the behaviour that we have is instinctive. It's more learned, and it's experiential. Mm-hmm. The things that coaches do, the decisions that coaches make, are experience-based. Mm-hmm. And obviously knowledge, because when we're planning things, we need to know what we're planning about. But we've got a bit of time to decide what we want to do. And then there's the less deliberative, where it relies more on we've been there before and we've seen it before, which brings us back. And it looks a wee bit like intuitive, like, oh, suddenly we thought about doing that. Well, no, we've done it before. And it's been going around in here for quite a long time. So we know what to do in that situation. So that cognitive element of coaching, to me, perhaps because I've written more about it, is important. But I would never ever say it's the only thing that's important, because I would immediately recognise that we are operating in a social context, and therefore the nature of the relationship between people does affect the impact that coaching relationship or process has. So we need to examine how we relate to each other. And that kind of brings you to a notion of perhaps how we should relate to each other. And then we get into a more discussion or can research into a more humanistic, a more person-centered approach to coaching. And then we become honest about it and say, well, is it person-centered in high-performance coaching? Well, it probably is. Some work a colleague Sergio Larabercial and Cliff Mallet have been doing on serial winning coaches. They are actually these are multiple Olympic winning world performance coaches who they work with. These are caring coaches. They care about the people they work with, but they also have to make decisions that are based on how do we win, because if we don't win, we lose our jobs.
So what's your thoughts on athlete-centred coaching? That word then, that's sometimes what I kind of wonder about. What is that?
Well, originally I got upset about it.
Tempered
as I get upset about lots of things. But mainly on the basis of saying you cannot not be athlete-centred. Coaching is athlete-centred because by definition, that's what it's about. What they really mean is the opposite of athlete-centred, which is not taking into account the feelings, the needs, the wishes, the developmental best practice of how to deal with human beings. So it's not so much that it's athlete-centred, than it has the potential to be non-athlete-centred. It's a little bit like ethics. We don't talk so much about how to treat people well as being sure that we don't treat them badly.
And we had a conversation, John, it was with Andrew Abraham, and we spoke a little bit about ethics and coaching, but beyond the legality element of it, because ethics probably is too, I kind of take the view of something like Andrew, at least in the way that I inferred his response to some of my questions, that we sometimes over bracket the word ethics. Ethics could actually be a really great starting point for conversations with coaches about how to sensibly push athletes and how to sensibly understand when not to, and have a lot of kind of nuance within that. But I wonder if that goes back to the theme that you've sort of identified there too, that, and going back to what we spoke about around the way in which a lot of academic papers are put forward. They do, and we spoke a little bit about this earlier on, but it does often feel like a bit of an audit. It often feels like we're trying to look for the things coaches are doing that we don't want, and the things that coaches can't do, but we probably aren't. Maybe that's a disservice sometimes. We need, considering we know that any one academic paper, in order to actually be worth reading, because any academic paper that tries to assume everything all at once, it won't be very good conversation. It's going to be difficult to capture, and it's better to have a bit of a siloed thought to a point, but in its conclusion, it needs to respect the other ways of seeing it. So I wonder if it just needs to be more about capturing experience and then allowing the readers to then decipher how to use that. Just like, observational work, it could just be capturing. Doesn't need to have a quota of things we need to see or those sort of elements.
Part of my response would be to two or three of the issues that we've discussed. It's going to be a bit like also what's the predominant focus of research at the minute. We do need to have more research that is carried out in situ. We need an awful lot more research that is actually based on what coaches do rather than what they tell us they do. So we still have lots and lots. I mean, as I said to you, worked on a couple of papers this week and been looking at literature at the same time. We still got an awful lot of literature that's based on questionnaires and interviews, principally interviews. Much of which I've done as well. Everybody, I think, who's an academic has been in this area at some time. But we have to recognise that questionnaires and interviews tell us about reported behaviour. They don't actually tell us what's going on, and we don't see it done in context. In general, about whether ethics are doing the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether in philosophical terms we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, in terms of social power and how we think the world should work, or even just in straight terms of social relationships and what constitutes a good developmental relationship and what doesn't. We need to do more research on what's actually happening out there. A bit like I've just said with the caring coaches that Sergio and Cliff Mallet found, that we just make this assumption that high-level coaches are not interested in their athletes because they're only interested in results. But that's simply not the case. And some of us have been there. We know, both ends of giving and receiving, if you like, that by and large coaches are caring about their athletes. So what we do is we tend to be holding them to a higher standard of some kind of mythical model that's come out of a paper somewhere. And then we say, well, coaching's not very good because they're not doing what this paper says they should be doing. No, I just can't go with that.
John, you cut off just for a wee moment there, John. I lost you just for a few seconds there.
You froze on my screen.
You froze on Yep. You're back. If you can just repeat
I'm just simply making the point that we do need more coaching research that's actually based on what coaches are doing in the context that they're doing it. And if we then want to take a social, cognitive, philosophical perspective, then fine. That helps us understand a little bit better. But we need to take all of them, not one predominating over the others. And there's another one which Julian has used in some of his writing, Julian North, where he calls it pragmatic. And that's kind of where I am with my research, is that it's based an awful lot on pragmatism. And pragmatism, again, has as much of an ontology and epistemology as all of the other isms. But the essence is that knowledge is only useful if it can be applied. That if you're going to find something, it's not worth finding unless you can actually use it. And that, for me, would be really a useful, simple axiom that we could use when we look at academic papers.
Yeah, there's so much abstractness.
Have you found something that we can use? And that's the bit you should be telling us about at the end of your paper. You should be telling us at the end of the paper that this is really important because this is what we can do with it.
So maybe have less words for strengthening limitations, have a bit more in the practical implications.
You should be seeking for knowledge that is useful and can be applied, and you should be finding knowledge that's useful that you can apply. If you're going to, by all means, write other papers, as I often do, which are conceptual, which talk about how important things are and how important terminology is or how we best interpret something. But when we're doing empirical work, then let's find things that are useful. Let's actually go into the situation. Let's find what coaches need to know rather than what they tell us they need to know, rather than what we think they need to know.
I think what you see, that resonates so much with me, John. Like, even, I mean, I discovered this through my PhD, being around influences on behaviour, and actually, when I was in with coaches and I would observe them for a month or 2 months, but even, before we finished the interview process, and what the observations provided was just a reminder that coaching's bloody hard. Like, coaching's difficult. And I think if there's something researchers can do, it's about having more empathy in their writing. Because when we were speaking a little bit about the cognitive versus social element, it's interesting because even being someone who's based within a psychology sphere, I've actually now grown to appreciate a lot of the sociological texts now, because I think they deal better with paradox, and I think they deal better with tensions and certain unexplained answers. I think they do a good job. I think orchestration has a lot of merit. Psychology has a limitation in that it's often dealing with the individual, and that works to a point. But then if you don't understand the individual, it doesn't operate in a vacuum, that you can go into these dead ends. I think you've done a great job of explaining around, just creating problems out of things that never will be answered. So it's like, what are you getting to? The other point I wanted to raise with that, John.
Can I just respond
to
that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Please tell me what you're thinking. Yeah.
Remember, I often say, remember what you were going to say.
Aye.
But I do think that's important. I think you came up with a really important statement there, which is that coaching's bloody difficult. Mm-hmm. Because it's a treatment-orientated occupation and process, well, lots of processes that are part of that, and because the problem is not necessarily easily dealt with, other than you want usually to get better, but you can then start to explore what that means. What it eventually means, it's not that much different sometimes in medicine and teaching and counselling and other things, is that we don't know what the problem is quite often, and we don't know what the solutions are. So that we are doing our best as professionals, with expertise, to come up with the solution, which is our training and preparation and all the other things we do, the solution that best fits the needs of the athlete that we have in front of us. The needs of the athlete we can find out by asking the athlete and being knowledgeable ourselves, but we are slightly different and this, I know this is me going on at length here.
No.
We are slightly different as a treatment occupation. I put it this way, because you can make me better as a doctor if you know what's wrong with me and you give me the treatment. We don't have the next person coming into the surgery trying to stop me from getting better. But what we do in sport is we kind of know what the problem is we want to get better at, and we want to try and win, or we want to try and do well, whatever. But there's other people who want to try and win the same things that we want to try and win. And so what that does is it clouds the notion of doing the right thing. So actually, it's very difficult to ever say that the coach is doing the right thing, because someone is always trying to stop you, and defining the problem therefore is difficult. So is coaching difficult? And you have problem athletes, and you have contractual disputes, and you have organizations to deal with, and you have media, and coaching is difficult. So that's the bit that's the bit that I'm interested in, because the bit I'm most interested in is to say, is it difficult? Yes. Could we write about how difficult it is? Yes. But the question is, how do coaches cope with it? Because coaches do cope with it. We don't have hundreds of thousands of coaches out there tearing their hair out because they don't know what to do. They're doing it. So somehow they are coping with this huge difficulty of being a coach. And that's the bit that I find the most interesting. That's the bit we should be investigating much more, how we are dealing with this problem.
Yeah. So stop looking
orchestration
at
is a great idea. I fully agree with it. I mean, there's other ways of saying it, but fully agree with it. But then you have to say, but how do we do it? Not just come back to the social aspects of orchestration, but how do we deal with the physical aspects and the social and the institutional and the interpersonal and the opponent-based enmity that you may get. So it's how do coaches cope with all of it? Because they clearly do. Otherwise, none of them would, some are obviously being successful. And that's why it was really interesting to do that work with Sergio and Cliff going, let's investigate the serial winning people. And we're just hopefully about to publish, haven't had the feedback yet, so I hope the reviewer's not listening. But Sergio and I have just written a paper looking at an individual coach who is hugely serial winning. So I won't say just what it's about at the minute, but hugely serial winning, and trying to get inside him to say, how do you do this? How do you cope with the problems? This is very high level professional career coaching for big bucks with big names. How do you cope with all of that? How do you actually manage to live from day to day with that? And for me, it's a very, very underexplored set of questions that should actually probably be directing much of our research.
Is that going to be an easier question to answer, perhaps, in performance sport, where experts are easier to identify? Because is it by the same principle that we understand that the coaching is domain specific? It's oftentimes actually where you see, like in a developmental context, people trying to mirror what elite performance coaches do. It actually isn't always the solution, because how you train a elite performer or how you train, even whatever type of athlete in that performance context might not always be as easy as reverse engineering that and diluting that to some other component. So I would wonder if that question's like, is it by coincidence that you are discovering that within an elite performance sphere, John, or is that a byproduct of just it being easier to sample in an elite performance, because you would need to go and figure it out?
It was opportunistic. We're interested in it. It was in a sport that one of us knows particularly well. It's one of these things where it fitted. But could we ask the same question of a participation coach operating with under 10s or under 12s or something like that? Well, the answer is yes. But we would be asking a different kind of coping question. What is it they're having to cope with? Well, they're not having to cope with the media pressure of trying to win. They're not having to cope with the notion of being sacked if they don't win the next whatever. Yeah. And their outcomes are not measured in terms of winning and medals and whatever. It's probably measured in terms of athlete. Now, athlete here is our under 10s. It's our athlete satisfaction, probably measured by whether they keep coming back and whether they're enjoying it and whether
that's what I mean.
And if they're enjoying it and coming back, we want to know how you cope with that, because they'll not all come back and they'll not all be smiling. So if you are being successful by those measures, you're doing something right.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I wonder if there's an exercise in itself about how we can better establish the criteria for what makes a successful coach without it becoming again entrenched within all the different ideologies. Because in a motivational lens, I could see a kid coming back isn't always associated with them enjoying the sport. It could be that they're controlled in their emotions, and that's not. Now, I know there's some laughing that we don't need to get into.
It could be because the parents said, we want to get rid of them for an hour.
So the thing I was wanting to ask you around, so see when we spoke about that, about the trend that you're noticing in a lot of interview-based studies and a lot of questionnaires, is higher education can we be critical of the system, I suppose? So we operate as academics within higher education, and there is a bit of a publisher peril thing happening there. Now, what I say to that is that and I fully agree, I believe that more ethnographic methods, more slow work is going to produce probably better measures of the realities of coaching insofar as capturing what coaches do, how they get around things. But that requires time and resource, and I always think about the pressures on academics to publish. And it probably lends itself alongside just the idea of juggling teaching with research. There's a dive bomb approach, I think. We go into an environment as quickly as we can do, because we don't really enjoy it. I don't actually feel a lot of academics enjoy the data collection process. They enjoy analysing it. But there's always this lead towards efficiencies in there. And I think what I feel you're getting at, and if I've understood it correctly, I wonder if because by the same margin we understand there's coaching domains, right? How our academics within coaching all fit within the same one bubble of academia. And the reason why we act in the way we do and the reason why we're rushed is because we're also prisoner to the same evaluative measures. If it's ref, if it's different things like that. If we're talking about what might create for ultimately better coaching practice, if we know that coaching practice is influenced so much by the academic medium, do we maybe need to have a conversation about how we evaluate the academic enterprise in that respect? Because if we're evaluating it in the same way that we evaluate loads of other disciplines, we could be guilty of not contextualizing our own job enough in the way that we approach it in order to capture better the domain-specific, difficult, pragmatic realities of coaching. I know that there's a lot of strands to that, but I just want to know, you're a researcher, you've been in this space, I don't know how many publications you've got, John, more than I can count. How does that resonate with your experience, and is that always a good thing, getting more publications out? Because it's easy for us to say don't publish as much, but it's not an easy thing, and recognising as well the job we have to try to work in coaches' best interest when their own work isn't maybe coinciding with that, if that makes sense. No,
I mean, I agree. Easier just to say I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The sentiment behind a lot of what you're saying. Doesn't
really get us anywhere, to be fair. It's just a comment.
Well, no, the question, the question, because it does make a difference it would make a difference in practical terms as to how much we publish and what we publish. I would suggest that we ought to be writing more that's of interest to coaches. But you also have to say that that's by and large not what academic journals are for. Academic journals are to share knowledge between academics. What we then have to say is, how do we get from that corpus of knowledge and understanding to applied knowledge and understanding, which coach educators, developers, governing bodies, and coach leaders can then translate into practice for coaches. So are we publishing too much stuff, if that's a non-jargon word? Yes. Is there a whole load of stuff out there that's not worth publishing? Yes. We probably have to distinguish, which sounds a little bit elitist, between those journals that will publish what for no fee and the journals that have sprung up, hundreds and hundreds of them, that will publish for a large fee. So if you want to be published, you can be published, but it will cost you money. And yes, we would be elitist about it and say, yes, but that's that journal. That doesn't really count because you can pay to get your paper in there. And in fact, though, they guarantee to turn it around in a month and, publish it. So the notion of publishing ethics and policy is really quite important to our professional area. And we are beginning to go down that route of you can get something published if you go to the right journal. Do we still publish? Let me, this again sounds a bit remote, but the tricky bit we have in comparison to, let's say, the sports scientists, and I think I've probably used this in lecture with you at some point, is if you want an easy paper, then you run somebody on a treadmill, you jab them in the backside with something, and you run them again, and you see whether they get better or not, and then you publish it. Or you do a test on some kind of ergonometer. We do a couple of weeks training and then we do it again and they get better and we publish it. So we get tons of biomechanics and physiology type papers that don't actually tell us how it's possible to jab them in the backside in an actual club context and decide whether they're actually doing anything that's any better or not. So there's a whole area there of talking about the kind of policies and the kind of publications that the problem with coaching it's not a problem. The issue with coaching is that we don't have what the academic world calls representative tasks. So if you want to know whether someone is relatively expert in an area, and it's usually hands-on things. So if it was something like plumbing or electricity or engineering or technology of some kind, you give them a representative problem and you see if they can solve it. And the expert can solve it better than the person who's not an expert. And that's how in some areas expertise is measured against what you call a representative task. But we don't have a representative task. What would it be? We could think of loads and loads of problems.
And how do you control a coaching space to the point where you can show cause and effect?
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen.
That's a wee bit the same as when we say to people, we're going to measure how good your planning is because you're on a coach education course. So we want you to give us your plan for the next 6 months. And you go, well, but I'm going to need another 15,000 words to tell you all about the person who I'm planning for. Because if I don't tell you that, you have no idea whether my plan's any use or not. So we come back to this notion of it's so particular, so contextual, so domain specific that we don't have any representative tasks. And, you know, you can think of, you've been there, you can think of what you do in your coach education programs when you put somebody in front of half a dozen people who are on the same course as you, and you tell them to teach them X, Y, or Z. And then you decide whether they do it well enough, and you give them a certificate.
And I think that, and I just think, and while we aren't necessarily arriving at solutions here, because that's for the next 40 years, I suppose, to see how they get to. It's still important, I think, just to raise the point, and maybe if I can briefly jump in there as well. I think that's why I've always been an advocate for coaches exploring different sources of information. Now, I appreciate that comes with elements of risk around authenticity of expert and where you can go. I think about podcasts as being a means in which that we can start to communicate messages with more nuance to a degree. There could be other types of, I think there needs to be probably be more of a allowance for informal learning, and maybe crediting that as recognising what coaches can learn from each other without our interference. It's not to replace the need for the academic, but I just think what we raise here, John, is just appreciating the conundrums that we can fall into, even, you know, and I think that why this conversation has been brilliant is to understand that coaching is a science, and becoming an expert in coaching research isn't the same as becoming an expert in coaching. And I think we need to learn from one another. So I just think it's about not chastising academics, but at least balancing it a little bit, because they certainly chastise coaches, and I'm complicit to it. We're all complicit to it. If coaches were to implement everything we told them to do, I would stop. I wouldn't want anything to do with that. I wouldn't do it. So
that's back to my question, Mark, that I had raised, was how, given all of those things that you could possibly tell the coach, how do they cope with that? Because they actually know an awful lot of that. They know that they're supposed to be doing this. So how do they cope with that? And yes, it's not so much, well, I think if I'm now going to put myself in the coach's hat, we can criticise academics for saying, you're not giving us the answers we need. I wonder if probably quite a lot of the answers are out there, but the way to access them is not to read academic papers. Academic papers need to be distilled over time and over broader collections of them to find what the answers are. Now, that would be helpful if the academics did more of their work in situ with real problems and over time. And more of that might allow us to synthesize better the answers that we need to help the coach to cope with the situations they find themselves in gradually over time. So that, yes, the high-performance coach is dealing with a different set of problems from the participation coach. But we can help both. And it's not necessarily I think we need, this is another debate, maybe we need another podcast.
It's a part 2 thing, yeah.
The coach education has not helped us by assuming that it needs to go 1, 2, 3, 4. It used to be 5. And this notion of being what you would call an assistant coach, and then a nearly coach, and then an almost nearly coach, and then a senior coach, and then a really, really good coach, or words to that effect, that this notion that we've never really come to, and this is the bigger why we need to spend more time on it. When you come out of medical school, you're considered to be a doctor. You're actually considered to be a junior doctor. And you're supposed to put time in before you, etc. When you come out of teacher training college, you're considered to be a teacher. You need to do a couple of years probation, but you're a teacher. You're not a nearly teacher. You're not an assistant teacher. You're not working that kind of, you're not a, we just got you off the street for 2 days teacher. And yet we are putting up with that. Now, what we do actually need is that kind of coach education system that actually just says, when you get to that stage, you're a coach. You're not a senior coach. You're just a coach. If you want to be a specialist in high performance areas, become a specialist. But you're a coach. There's a bottom line that says you're a coach. And that might apply to a participation coach the same as anybody else.
Yeah.
But that requires a whole different thinking about coach education. And remember, it's not a thinking that politically would rest easily on shoulders. Because we need to have level 1s and 2s in governing bodies, because 1, in some sports, they bring in lots of money. But 2, they actually are the people who go out there and do the work. Our gymnastics clubs and our swimming clubs and our football clubs are all full of level 1s and level 2 coaches. But do we think they've at the same level as saying this person's a teacher or a doctor or an architect or something else?
I think that's a great way to maybe cap off the conversation. I'll need to convince you to come back sometimes. I think, John, we'll need to chat about coach education in its own thing in terms of the NGB dilemma. So, John, honestly, I can't thank you enough. I think that's been so interesting for me and really reflective, just if I was being selfish, just to put the spotlight on myself. But for those that are listening, and we have a lot within the audiences that are, that listen to this podcast, that are coach researchers or student coaches, people that are trying to learn about coaching as an academic discipline, and they're the future. And it's just incredible to get your insight. Like, really can't stress it enough. It sounded like an absolute sook, but like, you are like a hero in the sense of like what
a Scottish.
I'll need to put subtitles on it. I'll annotate that one. But what you've done for the science of coaching is just incredible, John. So I can only just take my hat off to you. You're a massive inspiration to me and for anyone else that has any interest in coaching. They really should know your name if they don't already. So thanks so much, John, for coming along. I just really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to talk about coaching at any time with anybody. It's the kind of, if you're so steeped in it, then you just, and I actually found it very helpful. I found that interesting.
Thank you. That's good.
And I will be actually going back over it myself to think, well, some of the things you said there actually are quite, when I said talk to myself, I say, some of the things you came up with there, actually, I think that's quite interesting. But I hadn't really put it that way before. I need to think about that. And
one strength.
That's what podcasts and other things are for.
One strength of being daft, John, is I can just ask questions without needing to know enough about what I'm saying that something lands eventually. So no, thanks, John. And for those that are listening, guys, thank you so much for listening in. I hope this conversation has been as helpful to you as it has been for me. And we will see you next time. Thanks, John.
My pleasure.